Hi, I'm Cindy Gomez-Schempp, and I am very lucky to be able to interview today Reverend Philip Wheaton, who's an Episcopal priest, an activist, an author of over a dozen books. And you've been doing Latin American solidarity work since 1952. I know that you've worked in the Ecumenical Program for Inter-American Communications and Action, that you've lived in Costa Rica and in Nicaragua, that you've traveled all over Latin America.
And in the Dominican Republic for 12 years.
Oh, that's right, exactly. You're also on the Peace Committee in DC for Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And you're currently co-pastor in Washington, DC of the Ecumenical Community of Christ Church. I wanted to ask you today specifically about what's happening in Washington, D.C., what's being debated at this very moment, immigration reform. And your background as a theologian and as a historian, I think, could really inform the public about this debate. What do you have to say about immigration reform as an idea and where we are with that debate today in our country?
Well, the United States, since World War II, has always been using cheap labor from Mexico coming in to, Los Angeles and throughout the Southwest and so forth. And so, and those people always came in small groups or one by one. And so it's been going on for a long time, and they were always welcome because it was cheap labor. So the Mexicans were used as cheap labor regularly. And it wasn't until we got into NAFTA, see, the North American Free Trade Agreement really began to impose a whole economic policy upon Mexico, because Mexico was the third partner, along with Canada and the United States, and the third partner was Mexico, right? And that triumvirate, but Mexico was basically the place where we're going down to exploit the workers and the materials and so forth in Mexico. So it was really and Bill Clinton was involved in that thing. As a matter of fact, in the summer of, what was that year when it began in 80, I don't know, I don't want to get my dates wrong. No, it was in the 90s. It was in the 90s, and Bill Clinton came into power, and he was involved as one of the key figures to, well, he was president at that time. That's what he was president at that time. So he was the one who negotiated some of these agreements that went down.
Oh, yeah.
And and that through the policies mainly were for opening up Mexico to the transnational corporations, and also to put tremendous pressure on the Mexican government to get rid of a lot of its plants, or to throw a lot of workers out of workers, and that's where the first mass migration came from. So I call the immigration, the big immigration policies involving Mexico, Central America, and so forth, as forced migrations by our policies, as a result of our policies. Huge numbers being forced to flee north. Some of them came to the border initially to work in the maquiladoras along the border, U.S. corporations who had pulled out of the United States and gone down there for exploiting cheaper labor. But most of those people now were without jobs and had to leave.
Mm-hmm. And how did that affect farmers? Can you talk about the agricultural aspects of the migration of farm workers?
Well, the farm workers was a thing that goes back, because they were initially individuals, but then they were organized. Cesar Chavez was a key person in organizing them and pulling them together. And so that became, not only in terms of fruits and so forth that they were harvesting, but in terms of them now starting to go on the march. I mean, it was like they became a political movement in addition to their working as camps. And to this day, one of the greatest contradictions in the whole immigration policy is that they continue to bring in contract laborers in large numbers. And they don't have papers. They are undocumented, but they fly them in because they're a certain group of, if you're the right person and have, pulled the right buttons, you can bring in a whole bunch of people for a harvest or a planting into the United States to this day. And no one says anything about it. So there's a lot of loopholes once again, to favor the multinationals, regardless of the laws. And they keep on blaming these individual poor people who drift across the border as undocumented, but they carry out the process of the exploitation of cheap labor south of the border.
Yeah, and we've seen that like in Postville, Iowa, they had was all over the television, they had one of the largest redadas, capturing, sweeping
pickups
a whole town of Postville. And they processed like 500 some people at the fairgrounds. I'm actually originally from Iowa, at the fairgrounds, and like in the place where they keep the cattle, that's where they actually processed all of the
cattle.
people, like cattle, chained at their feet.
Really?
Yep. And they decimated the economy of this small town. But we've also seen those raids happen in Minnesota. Very recently, there was the Cast 23 here that were a group of people that escaped. They were trafficked from the Katrina area. They were brought in by big companies that they were supposed to be doing pipe fitting.
Trafficking.
They were trafficked. They were lied to. They were brought here under false pretenses. And I was speaking to what you were saying, that companies, multinational companies, are able to, perpetrate this lie in other countries, advertise openly that they will give visas or residency or citizenship to these people, but they're not prosecuted. And here are now, under the governor, Drew Wrigley, prosecuted these people for identity theft, even knowing that they had been victims of human trafficking where they were, and they had escaped because they were under special visas. So the conundrum here is, because people sit on this one side of the debate or the other side of the debate, well, we should punish the employers more. The people that are hiring these illegals, they should be punished more. Or you have the people that are saying, we have to stop illegal people from coming here because they're taking our jobs. Could you speak a little bit about those two ideas, and what do you think about those positions in terms of reality and history?
Well, I don't know if you know that the other aspect of the work that I did and did with many other people was the flow of refugees that came across into Texas and was part of what we call the sanctuary movement. And we helped mobilize nationally over 400 churches and synagogues to take refugees and to give them asylum, and take them into the churches and protect them and tell the police, don't touch them, these are our guests here. And so the sanctuary movement really began to, and that was mobilized out of almost all religious people. We're talking about religious people here, Christians and so forth, who were into justice and so forth. And they set up a center in Chicago.
Was this the woman that was in the Chicago with her son?
Yes. All those people were part of what Chicago did, is to find places to send these. I mean, they would contact people all over and say, can you take a half a dozen people here and a half a dozen there and so forth? And they got distributed throughout the United States on a systematic basis, coordinated, because the people down there were just helping people come across the border and get into safe circumstances from all that they'd been through to cross. And then they got into this movement, and then the movement supported them. And over the 8 years, the sanctuary movement began in 80 and ended in 88. And we brought thousands of these people in, and almost none of them got prosecuted. And finally, we were able to get papers for them. So it was a new kind, and we called it the New Underground Railroad.
Yeah, it's incredible because, churches or people in religion are not supposed to be political, you're not supposed to take positions, you're not supposed to preach from the pulpit, but you are a different breed of pastor. I mean,
Well, yes, but we did that very openly. See, everything was open. We didn't do anything undercover. There was no deception. We told people, we made announcements in the newspapers that we were going to do this, and we would have celebrations of the arrival of these people with the press there and taking pictures of the whole thing. So it was very, very public, and they didn't know how to handle that kind of an approach. It was really a tactic on our part, you know. But then we went to the congregation and we said, are you ready to accept this thing? And they said, is it against the law? We said, yeah. Well, will we get into trouble if we do this? Yeah, but you have to remember that there's something that's more powerful than the law. And they said, what? Love. And we'd win people over on these kind of arguments. Well, all right, I mean, they're human beings, okay. And so they would take them into, and in all those years, they never invaded any of our sanctuaries.
And I'll ask you this it's a really wonderful strategy. I'll ask you though to speak, to preach a little bit about what is the theological stance on why you get to violate the law, or why you can look at this law of man and say, yeah, I don't think that that's something that applies to what my work is or what I should support. So obviously you don't support keeping a wall at the border and keeping people out if you created this movement, or you helped to start this movement.
There used to be a wall in Europe between the East and the West, and they tore it down. Today there are two walls. One between Texas or Central America and the United States, and the other Israel against the Palestinians. These are the things that are most hated by people, because they're like, we are nobody. We're outside the wall, So symbolically, it's much worse than beating someone up or whatever, because you're basically discriminating against them and saying, you're not worth anything. You don't have any rights, And many people, many Hispanics that have come in have told me that's the worst part of it. So I think that that's just an incredibly horrible or revealing symbol of the demonic aspect of the U.S. society.
Well, and I think that there's, you've written a ton of books about Latin America. You really talked about the conditions of poverty and war and really what our role is in the United States. I think that's something that people don't necessarily get to hear about a lot or understand. But could you talk a little bit about how the U.S.'s role in destabilizing a lot of Latin American countries has really added or increased that exodus from those countries, so that people can understand that it's not just about jobs or taking jobs. It's really, there's other aspects that make people come to this country, and you probably could speak to some of those reasons why people have to come to this country very well.
Yes, I think in a funny way, because the Hispanics are now a majority over the African Americans, which is really telling, and for a lot of African Americans, they like to be in that underdog role because they got a lot of favor and a lot of,
Political clout.
advantages by being the low man on the totem pole, so to speak. And so I think that a lot of the immigrants have come in and expected, great things about the United States for all of the hype that has been given to, now you have a chance to make it big and now you can find a job. And they have found that they have been basically rejected up there, and a lot of them have gone back, because even though they are poor back there, it's better than standing on a street corner waiting for someone to come and pick you up in his vehicle to take you home and do some work. And I think that it has really soured the whole relationship, but at the same time, they're coming in ever increasing numbers. And not too long ago, we had a big protest against the war in the Middle East in Lafayette Park in front of the White House. And 3,000 people came. And we were pretty happy about that. 3,000 people, all kinds of people, men, women, old, young. And that was on a Saturday, and the next day there was an event on the mall, and I decided to go to it. And I counted at least 5 of those kind of white-looking people there. The number was 350,000 Hispanics turned out for that rally compared to our anti-war movement. 350,000 protesting the injustice against their being here in the country when most of those people had some kind of documents now and some kind of rights or green card or whatever. And so this means that they were also, the Hispanics are not just another immigrant group that molds itself into the American society and becomes part of it, but in fact they are saying, no, meet us on our terms. Meet us in the terms of our difference, not in terms of whether we can become like you and meld into the American society, but rather face each other. And I think this is what Jesus was dealing with in terms of going down to the fishermen, the poor fishermen in the Lake of Galilee. And a professor, Catholic from Chicago, has just written a book called Theologizing en Spanglish. That's the title, Theologizing en Spanglish, because of this 2 sides of their new language thing. But her whole theme is we have to meet others on the basis of who they are, not who they should become. Because we can learn new things from people who have different perspectives. So come together on the basis of our differences and learning from each other. It's a whole new kind of philosophical concept about how you deal with the others. I mean, you can be paternalistically charitable to them and things like that, or you can throw them out because they're not legal, or you can say, hey, wait a minute, maybe they have something to teach us.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I think we do have a lot of things to teach each other. And I'm going to ask you a little bit of a controversial question because, as you know, there have been many types of wars that we wage, among them drug wars. And in this country, as we know now, as we look back and analyze this, we've seen the high numbers of indigenous Northern Native Americans, Latinos, as well as blacks that were incarcerated as a result of this war on drugs, many of them for petty drug offenses. But in Mexico, we have a drug cartel issue. And I know that you probably know the origin of the Zetas and the role of the American government in training them, as well as Israel in training the Zetas that are now the mass murdering drug cartel we hear about on the news all the time. And it's really, I think that we've heard a lot of this stuff in the news, heads chopped off, bodies here, and it just, all people think about in the United States is criminals, drugs, terror, fear. What do you have to say as a theologian now, and put on that hat for a second, about wars on drugs in general, this particular one in Mexico, and how it's affecting the immigration debate? How is that, in your perspective, how should we be looking at that issue?
Well, I think that Obama is battling with the fact, with the reality, that they are now a permanent feature of the United States, and they can't be eliminated and resolved by sending them back or anything like that. So how do you best incorporate them in? And they're talking about techniques about doing that. One of those is Well, yes, but it's going to take some years, and they have to pay for all the time that they've been in the United States. Things like this, now trying to exploit them, like, well, if you work as a slave for 7 years, we might give you a citizenship card, And the whole thing goes back to these other practices, but I think that he knows, and many other people know, we can't get along. I mean, the workforce, I'll just tell you a personal story. I'm sitting in my house, and a team of people come into our neighborhood to redo the curbs in the sidewalks. And they're out in front of our house, and they're doing our curbs and sidewalks. And I look out, and they're all Hispanics. And so I go out, and I'm looking at them, and there's a straw boss over here, a person who's in charge of them. He's a white man with a grizzly beard, and he's sitting there kind of futzing around, and they're laying concrete. And so I went to him first, and I said, how are things going? Fine. I said, how are these people doing? Okay. I said, do they know what they're doing, in terms of concrete? Yeah, they're pretty good. So I then went over to the Hispanics, and I said, how are things going with the concrete? Fine. And I said, what about your straw boss? He doesn't know anything about laying concrete. And I said, does he have to come over and check on what you're doing? And they said, hey, we know this cold. And they do. They did a marvelous job. But you can find this multiplied by the thousands all over the United States. So they are now a key factor in our society. They are, and they're, well, if you go back to Central America, and I'm sure that my friend from El Salvador can tell you this, in past history, the Salvadorians were the beasts of burden. They carried all kinds of heavy loads from one country to another, back and forth. And I used to work with the Nicaraguans and with the Salvadorians. And the Salvadorians were always there 15 minutes ahead of time and had all their stuff and got the job done. And the Nicas appeared about 45 minutes late, didn't have anything like a ladder or whatever else they needed. And I love them both, but they're entirely different kinds of personalities in terms of how they function. But the Salvadorian and many of these people, they have become the aggressive economic power in this country. I mean, they are pushing our economy forward. And you won't find very many cities that don't have their announcements in Spanish as well as in English. Mm-hmm. So it's a reality they have to live with, and I think that he knows that. I mean, Barack Obama knows that, and so he's trying to find a smooth, easy way in terms of the people who don't want these other people coming in, because he knows that they can't not have them here. We need them, and that's where we talked about contract labor. They're bringing them in anyway. The powers and the corporations are transporting these people in to plant or harvest and sending them back again. They don't have any papers. So we're using them one way or another. And half the time we're not talking about these kinds of realities.
Right. And there's a further exploitation. I'll tell you personally, I think the Latino community, the Hispanic community in general has a love-hate relationship with Barack Obama because he signified such hope. He made a lot of big talk promises to Latinos who he knew were a big voting bloc.
Right.
And many, like my father, still gets upset at me when I talk about this because I convinced him not to vote for Hillary. And he was going around campaigning for Hillary. And I was like, no, Dad, this year we must go with Barack Obama. He's going to change this and this and this.
You said that.
Oh, yes, I convinced my father to do this. And this last election, he had to convince me to go vote. That's how angry I was. Because I felt like, well, you know this. Since the Bush administration, Barack Obama has deported, in his first term, more than 1.5 million people.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
He's deported more people than any president.
Yeah.
He has put, in 2012, it was over 400,000 people. And I'm talking about steadily 250,000 people.
Yeah.
Guatemaltecos, Ecuatorianos, Dominicanos, you name it, a lot of them Mexican, yes. But with a little extra thing. Because now we have privatized prisons. And now we're not just deporting them. we're catching them. It's like we're fishing. We're catching them. Now we're going to send you to the private prison where Geo Group or this other company gets to make a bunch of money, and the counties make money because they're also making money, and all the politicians and the local governments are getting into the action. Local police officers are acting as ICE officials, even in our own communities here.
You mean ICE when you say ICE?
ICE, yeah.
I mean some of
And that added layer of what I see as a form of exploitation, I think that it has, I think that it has changed the way that we talk about the immigration debate for me as a Latina. This isn't about people taking jobs versus, I mean, to me, this has to be fixed because it's a human rights crisis. We have so many children, US-born citizens, and then we have even crazy people walking around saying that people like me, anchor babies, who were the firstborn who got my parents' citizenship, should have theirs taken away. So there's this real like use, abuse, exploitation, and hatred of not just the illegal immigrants, but all immigrants. We see it in Arizona and Georgia, these places where we have the Joe Arpaios of the world. What do you think of are the long-term effects, societally, of these types of policies, of the long-term deportation, the long-term abuse of children, removal of families, putting people in jail for, on average, about a year so they can make this much money off of them before they deport them back? I mean, the deaths in Juarez of thousands of women, maquiladora workers, I mean, all of that. What is the effects, not just for Mexico, but for the United States of America?
Well, because you're from Mexico and so forth, let me start there. And I think that it's very difficult to know who's responsible for things. And I'll start in Bolivia with the drugs, because they are the ones who pick the coca leaves and they chew them. And it doesn't do any great harm to them. They don't do anything more, and they ship the coca leaves up to Colombia and they process them and chemicalize them up there. That's where it turns into cocaine. Mm-hmm. Turns into cocaine and becomes really dangerous, and it's brought then into the United States, and people profit off of that. Conversely, the drug people in Mexico can go across the border into the United States and buy guns without any problem whatsoever and take them back to enhance their operation of controlling cities and so forth with the guns that they bought from the gringos. And then the gringos help them out too, because they buy the cocaine and it makes a good profit for the people who are dealing with that. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing is so convoluted that certainly there's far more guilt on the American side than there are anything that you could, claim that the other people haven't done anything wrong. And so but I think that there is a combination of determination on the part of the newly arrivals, because I think it's happened in every generation in the United States. We're a country of immigrants. How can we deny a new wave, because we've been doing it from the very beginning? So I think the problem is that we have embittered many of our former allies that used to respect the United States are no longer aficionados or, people who love the United States anymore in Latin America because of the way their own people have been treated and mistreated.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that you are part of a group, you support the Zapatistas, I'll say that, and I wanted you to talk about the Mexican government itself, what's happening in Mexico, and how do you see that, those types of conflicts in Mexico, how do you see that playing a role in the future of Mexico? Because one of the things that's been discussed a lot is, well, if they could just get their, government in shape over there, there wouldn't be this mass exodus of people. What do you see for the future of Mexico?
I think that's really a question for you to answer better than I can answer. I mean, in terms of what's really going on among the Mexican people, but there are different things. It's not just the drug thing. I Mexico is making progress in other areas, a lot of production and so forth. But there's a lot of problems left over. And certainly the indigenous problem in Chiapas is an unresolved problem, and they're still determined to go forward as an indigenous people on their own with their own kinds of goals and customs and so forth. And we grew to have tremendous respect for the indigenous during that conflict, went into many of their communities and so forth and saw how they had organized. And so Subcomandante Marcos, really, people don't understand that, but he came in as a novice, and he was really converted by them after a long period of time of living with them and so forth. Right.
Yeah.
And he really is a great, as he says, I'm not a leader, I'm a secondary person. They're the ones who make the decisions. And so that whole dynamic really, I think, reflects a maturation part of people in Latin America always used to look up to the United States. They're not doing that so much anymore. They're beginning to question that. Brazil doesn't, follow the Pied Piper from the United States. Argentina doesn't, Chile doesn't, Bolivia doesn't, and Ecuador doesn't.
Venezuela.
And so
Cuba.
those countries are beginning to, give Assange asylum in London in the Ecuadorian consulate there. And the president just said, we'll keep him at least for another 5 years if it takes that. It was in the papers yesterday.
I didn't see that.
Right.
That's amazing.
And so they're just openly saying, well, that's what our policy is, and the government of the United States hasn't showed us any reason why we should change our policy. I mean, guapo. I mean, they're starting to stand up to people and say, hey, wait a second. It's a matter of human rights, Mm-hmm. And the United States is, apart from its policies, is caught in these fundamental moral issues of injustice.
No, I'll ask you one final question. With the current debate on immigration policy, I'm going to ask you a policy question. And it's also, I think, an issue of human rights, because we're talking about the lives of people that hang in the balance. 11 million by some estimates, and we think there's even many more than that. When they talk about a pathway to citizenship, it sounds very nice. It's almost like we're on the yellow brick road. But when you talk about a 13-year wait and all of the things you were talking about earlier, how feasible and how useful do you think that a bill that passes that requires people to pay back fines, we're talking about people in extreme poverty, many of them living like sardines in a can, to be able to send enough money home to make this whole trip of misery useful, and the fact that they paid a coyote to get across, and you know what it's like. So how feasible really is it going to be for a reasonable percentage of that 11 million to even come up with the money, come out of the shadows, put themselves in danger of deportation anyway? Like, our government's really been really forthright and keep honoring their promises. How feasible do you think it is that will actually help people? And do you think that that we should, as a nation, push for something that's more favorable, it would give people a pathway to citizenship sooner? What are your thoughts about the exact bill itself in its present form?
When the Salvadorans and Guatemalans came in the first wave in the 1980s by the millions, after they got in and had crossed undocumented, they were able to go through the court system and get some kind of recognition or a green card or citizenship. And many hundreds of thousands of them, because I know many, many cases that were able to do that, they have now clamped down on that kind of process, and they're now trying to make it very, very difficult so we won't get any more of those terrible people coming up. I think that the United States is in a ideological bind between needing these people, needing them, and not wanting to have them. Because
it sounds like an abusive marital relationship of some sort.
But it's a funny thing to say that, but we've got to have these people in because they're the lifeblood of the future of our economy, to make it very simple. On the other hand, they are alienating a lot of the people towards the policy, or if not alienating, many of those people are now operating more on their own rather than in a dependency relationship to Big Brother. You know the slogan about Mexico in relationship to the United States.
Yep.
Would you repeat it, please?
Yes, I was going to mention it. Ay, pobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de los Estados Unidos.
And in English?
It means, oh, poor Mexico, so far away from God and yet so close to the United States.
Exactly. And so I think that many of your people that have come up from Latin America still are very good Catholics.
Oh, yes.
And other things. And so they're very secure in themselves. I find the new wave of these Mexicans, unlike even African Americans, are really organized. They're organized. And they're not going to take no from anyone, you know. And I also find this economic alternatives where in Latin America now these countries can turn to China and to Russia for trade and that kind of thing. So the competition is now at a global level. We're looking at a global situation of not just a continental things that they have to deal with. So I think that the United States is in a bind that it can't resolve nicely. And so I don't know how this is going to come out, but I think that in not too distant future, the United States is going to gradually soften their line and realize that they can't beat them, so join them.
Well, I hope that happens eventually. I'm going to make a prophetic guess at what I think is going to happen. And I think they're going to keep the status quo. Because if they pass a bill that makes it 13 years into the future for you to get your pathway to citizenship, most people that are here undocumented are so afraid of even showing up for census or anything like that, that they're not going to feel safe in doing that. They may not have the means, probably won't have the money to do it, and they'll have to continue to work in the shadows. But we have this facade that we've given people a pathway to citizenship, so you still have the Latino voting bloc. Hey, we gave you the thing, remember? And I think that it'll continue to keep businesses happy because they still get the cheap labor. And actually, by giving all these people a pathway to citizenship, you've made it so you can't undercut them by using undocumented people that are willing to take jobs in horrible labor conditions and not pay the documented.
See, except for the other factor that you're not mentioning, the secret factor that God is giving them.
Which is?
They produce children, and those children are citizens because they're born in this country, and they're the ones who are going to have the vote as they grow up. And I talked to a family, because we support a family with Ricarda and Jessamia, who happen to be Salvadorians, and they have 2 boys, and they have 3 children, and the boys were undocumented, but the 3 girls are born in the United States. And I talked to Mabel, who is the oldest of them. She's 12. And I said, Mabel, how's your English? And she replied to me, better than yours. And so they're producing a whole new generation of people who are Latinos, but I'm American.
Yes, that was one of the first goals I wanted, because I got teased so badly about my accent. I didn't even learn English until 3rd grade. Was I'm going to learn English better than the people here speak.
There you go.
Well, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for the interview.